Welcome, and thank you for joining this webinar today. Before we begin, I would like to go over some housekeeping notes. Please note that your microphone is automatically muted. If you have any questions, we encourage that you write them in the Q&A box located at the bottom right of your screen. Ensure you submit all your questions to all panelists and not specific individuals. You will only be able to see your questions, as it remains anonymous. If you wish to personalize your webinar view, you may do so through the icon at the top right as displayed on this slide. Please note that this webinar will be recorded. Thank you, and I now hand over to Laura McGaughan, Head of Worldwide Airport Slots.
Hi, and good afternoon, and good morning to everyone joining us today. Thanks so much for joining this webinar. IATA has been running a number of them on different topics, and we're delighted today to bring you this Scheduling for Restart webinar with 4 of our experts in this area from our member airlines. First, as always, with any discussion around schedules and this sort of nature of the industry, we have to ensure that we are covered by competition law guidelines. So everybody talking on this panel will, of course, be covering and agreeing to these guidelines, and we will maintain adherence to these through the whole session. Indeed, any questions that are asked during the session that we do try and respond to at the end will also have to comply with these guidelines shown here on the screen. So before we get further into the session, I just want to make sure that everybody's aware you can ask questions to both ourselves as IATA and the panel members throughout the webinar. Just make sure you click submit and we will receive that question, and we'll have chance at the end to come to as many of those as we can. Before we get into the panel discussion with our expert member airlines, we would like to go over some of the background with you today. There's been a substantial loss of flights within the last couple of months within the airline industry, and I'm sure for everybody on this session, I don't need to regale the stories of just how severe and drastic this has been for the airlines. The flight reductions were dramatic and overnight, and we can see that almost nothing has operated for April and May, substantially impacting the carriers' ability to manage their schedules and flying program. But indeed, there is some light at the end of the tunnel, and what we see now is the airlines looking at how they restart their flying schedules, and they're starting to look at rebuilding their operations in what is a very different set of circumstances. There's a number of huge external factors that they are having to cope with, which I'm sure they're going to discuss today with us. One of these in particular that we've been able to look at is the passenger behaviour and demand impacts in China. And one of the issues that the airlines are having to sort of manage as they move forward into this restart phase is, what are the passengers' behaviours going to be and how they change? How are they going to respond to this crisis, and how are we going to get passengers back on aircraft? The opening of the domestic markets in China have shown as a proxy, I suppose, for other markets that will open in due course, just how different those behaviours could be. And for now, what we're seeing is a dramatically different booking pattern, which makes scheduling so much harder when at the moment it looks like 60% of passengers are actually booking only 3 days or less in advance of the flight. Of course, this creates a big question mark around how you put that schedule together among all the other factors that we're going to discuss. So without further ado, I'd like us to get into the main event, which is discussing with these 4 experts in scheduling what their views are on how the industry will recover. So I'd like to hand over to Dimitar, who's going to host the first part of this session.
I would like now to introduce to you our panelists today and open the discussion. We have Michelle Boyce, Director Airport Access from United Airlines, Jörg Bauer, Director Airport Capacity and Strategic Slot Management from Lufthansa, Paul Petrikovic, Manager International Schedule Planning from Qantas, and Santiago Tua, Director Schedule Planning at LATAM. We are very aware the last few months have seen unbelievable levels of cancellations and schedule changes. Without providing any strategic or competitive information for your carrier, can I ask the panelists to describe how the last few months have unfolded and what's keeping you busy at the moment?
Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Dimitar. I'll go ahead and start the response to this question. These have been a very challenging few months for the airline industry, not just for us, but also for our customers. The travel restrictions that started coming on in January, late January, February, were unforeseen in this industry. It's something that hadn't happened in the recent history that many of the employees had encountered. As we were working into it and getting into March, it was growing. It was clear that it wasn't just an isolated problem, but turning into a global problem. And as those travel restrictions kept going, they were also rolling. And that's been one of the big challenges, is understanding not only, as Laura had showed on the previous slide, about consumer demand, but that's the rebuilding, but also the cancellations. At first, restrictions were into March 15th and then April 1st. And then, expanding from there. Nobody knew how long this was going to last. We were being very reactive, very nimble, very agile in trying to bring down our networks, really testing the abilities of all of our resources, whether it be our computer systems, the external GDS systems who actually publish our schedules, our operating systems, and of course our people as well, trying to work through these issues. It's been a very challenging time trying to understand the government restrictions. These aren't airline decisions. These are government-imposed restrictions as to who can fly, what sort of customer can board the airplane, what documentation do they need, and where can we offer those services to help bring our citizens home. The repatriation flights that are definitely been a big part of our flying over the last few months, getting people back to where they need to be during these challenging times. We've worked through these issues together as teams. Within our company, it's really been a wholesome group. It's the regulatory environment trying to understand the government restrictions. It's the operating teams working closely with the schedule planning teams, trying to work together to see what we can support, where can we fly, and how do we make that the best service we can to bring home our customers right now.
Thank you, Michelle. Can I ask perhaps Jörg also to present from your point of view at Lufthansa?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. In retrospect, actually, it was a tremendous team effort at Lufthansa Group across all hierarchies, departments like scheduling, crew planning, ops control, maintenance operations. Actually, parking spaces became a big issue pretty soon in the process. And also companies within the Lufthansa Group, all the airlines, but also support companies as well. Once we canceled the flight to China in the end of January, it became very clear to us that this was not only a winter issue. Actually, already in February, we were discussing with regulators, besides the conference in Florence, Italy, the need for more flexibility regarding cancellations, also for the upcoming summer. That started end of March. So actually, luckily, we got home just before the lockdown in northern Italy started. And actually, pretty much at the same time, we saw in our booking and revenue management departments the evaporation of bookings of customers. And we also saw a huge increase in no-show rates at our flights that were actually operating. So with Italy, the coronavirus really arrived in Europe and immediately influenced the behavior of all our customers across the place. And actually, the next step was a big point in time was the surprising closure of the US borders to European customers and visitors on the 14th of March. Immediately, we have to cancel 70 flights a day to the US. Actually, that number was a surprise to me. It never came to my mind that we had actually 70 flights per day to the US. Amazing number that still puzzles me. Anyway, so with most of our important markets closed and restrictions coming in day by day, we had to cancel and ground the whole airline group. So it was like 70%, 50%, 30%, finally ending up at 5% that we are still operating for the last 2 months now. Right now, we are very busy, actually still with the summer season, with repatriation flights, freighters, auxiliary freighters, and flying also harvest workers into Western Europe to secure the harvest. You never have thought about that a business case for an airline would be flying harvest workers. One of those flights makes as much work as a daily full season service. So these nimble steps in keeping the operation at least running is making a lot of work. We are also working on a limited restart in June and on scenarios for the winter schedule, but with no visibility when regulations will be lifted and bookings will return, it's pretty much flying in the dark. Thank you.
And now, if I would like to ask Paul Petrikovich from
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone that's on the webinar or the call. We're much the same as my other two colleagues as with what we've been doing since mid-February. I mean, the big thing for me is we've had to completely rethink how we plan our future flying. Normally over this period of time, we would have been thinking about the Northern Winter 20 slot conference, working on contingency plans for flights that didn't get the slots that we had requested, and looking at what we would do in our normal filing process. Instead, what's taken up all of our time is trying to plan and replan our schedules over the next coming weeks. Others have mentioned, and we're absolutely no different here at all. Sometimes we're planning a week ahead, sometimes we're planning days ahead. It's been very uncertain with border closures as different restrictions are applied both internationally and domestically for us. It makes our life very difficult. On several occasions, we had just finished a plan of how we were going to fly the next couple of weeks, pushed it out to our resource areas to see whether our plan could actually be implemented and flown, only to find out that some other, whether it's a domestic border or an international border, had closed. We had to put everything on hold and then start our whole planning process basically again. It was a very testing time for the team. And, you know, to be honest with you, when we look at it, a long-term plan for us in most cases was what we were flying next week rather than what we would normally be looking at flying next season. For me personally, the pace and the volume of change at these times was quite overwhelming, and I'm sure my team, when I speak to them, also felt exactly the same way. In most cases, people had worked in February for 21 to 28 days straight without any sort of break to try and get some sort of flying pattern together that that we would be happy to fly. Personally, again, I never thought I'd work for an airline. Publishing the amount of cancellations that we published to our current schedule. In most cases, we published our schedule down to 5% of what we would normally fly in a very short time. In other words, what we were trying to do next week. And it continues to go that way with a very uncertain future at the moment. It is still very difficult, and I mean, I guess that's what's kept me up at nights.
Thank you, Paul. And last but not least, can I ask Santiago to provide your perspective?
Yeah, Dimitar. Hi, Dimitar. Hello to everyone. I will try to put some flavor of Latin America in this webinar. In our case, we are still facing some lag with the COVID-19 here in Latin America. In several countries, we are picking the active cases of COVID-19. Also very bad picking on death here, and maybe this will be the reality for the next 2 to 4 weeks. And because of that, we are still flying 5% of our itinerary in May, and we are looking at the very low recovery rate for the next month. And in the last 2 to 3 months, what really happens here is very bad, because since the end of March, and we operate here in Latin America in different domestic markets, that we implemented very tight lockdowns of the countries, and And in our case, because we operate in different countries, we need to try to understand which country will be closed for how long. And these measures were taken in a very short notice period. Then it was very challenging for the scheduling team or for the whole team of LATAM and the operations team how to understand this difference in each of the restrictions from each of the countries, and how to redo and replan our schedules as soon as we have the new information of the countries. And I could say that this is still our reality. We're still with several countries in lockdowns, some domestic, some international, some full, and we're still trying to understand and build scenarios in thinking about when this lockdown will be eased and when we could return to flight. And this scenario, we redo our network like twice a week in the last, mainly in April and May. Okay, that was very challenging. And on the other hand, there was the good part that we could help the whole communities here in Latin America how to repatriate the people that were stuck in each of the countries to return to their homes. And also a very important thing, we could help the government in the freighter flights, mainly to China in the last month, helping to try to make these flights for the sake of the medical treatment of the people that live in the country. Then it's like a very challenging time, but also you could look at how an airline in a region could help the communities in this very contingency and very unusual moments. That's from my side.
Thank you, Santiago, very much for your perspective. We have heard, and it was explained clearly how different this period is for everybody with regards to the normal planning process. So now I would like to ask Michelle and Jörg, with your experience in the area of slots and scheduling for your airline, do you think this is the start of a new era for planning and scheduling for the restart and the recovery phase?
Hi, Dimitar. I'll go ahead and start with this one. I do think it's the beginning of the recovery phase right now. We have to bear in mind that we have only had a global slot use waiver now for just over 5 weeks. The waivers from the coordinators for the summer 2020 season and the regulators came out in phases. And it's been only approximately just over 5 weeks that we've actually had a global waiver for the rest of the summer. During that same time that we were getting the summer waivers, we were also then having the extension of all the travel restrictions. So we were spending as much time thinking about the future and what we were going to do with the rest of the summer as we were spending time just reacting to the latest information about the latest travel restrictions. We're finally to a point now that we understand that there is a summer waiver and that we will be looking to take that forward for the rest of the summer and starting to think a little bit ahead. For example, I could say that, as we're starting to publish the next phase of our schedule with the latest information, while that phase also has a lot of cancellations moving into July, we also are dealing with very close in. We're dealing with the next week, not only with cancellations, but also with additions. So we have seen on a daily basis, we are hearing of travel restrictions that are being extended, but we are also hearing of passenger demand in places that were unexpected. And so we have flights being added as we have flights being canceled in as little as a week's notice. It's making us be very nimble and very agile right now. We want to be there when the passengers' demand is there, when the passenger demand recovers. The airlines want to be there to provide the service that they're being asked to provide. But we don't know what that's going to be. It's a very uncertain time. And it's really not up to the airlines, the airports, or the airport coordinators to make that decision. It's really a government-imposed restriction. As long as these travel restrictions keep being rolled out and rolled forward, we are going to be in a bit of a reactive mode. Our normal process of working, our normal timelines of publishing schedules and selling tickets simply won't apply. The other challenge we have is just keeping the GDS systems up to date right now. they have a huge queue and backlog due to the volumes of schedule changes that are being made. And trying to keep that information as fresh and current as possible so that people do have the options to travel and can look for where they want to get away as the travel restrictions are coming. The big thing to try to understand right now is customer demand. You know, we have seen, as I said on Laura's slide earlier, that customers are booking much closer in, but they're also holding those bookings that they have or had previously bought for the summer season much further out to wait until right before to see if they're able to take their holiday or not. So we don't have good consumer demand right now to really base our decisions. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I totally agree with Michelle on those issues. Taking maybe a little bit broader perspective, I think the current crisis is not a new era, but a longer period of recovery than we have experienced with 9/11, with SARS Iraq, and with the global financial crisis. And Michelle and myself, at least, we have all lived through those experiences. So the current scheduling and slot coordination process that we have, that is time proven and well balanced, globally harmonized, an approach for all stakeholders, and its deadlines and procedures offer much needed certainty and continuity in these challenging times. It offers continuity for our customers, as Michelle pointed out, but also for airlines that have to continue to invest in modern environmental friendly aircraft. But most important, it offers flexibility in time of crisis to temporarily adjust to market change and quickly adjust to new operational and regulatory requirements. So in extraordinary times like now, when even more flexibility is needed, the current process even offers support for the recovery through temporary alleviation of some of the core rules of slot allocation, like for example, the use it or lose it rule. But only temporarily. We need to return to the proven global standard once the new normal is reached. So it's not a new era in my point of view, but it's a very extended crisis that will take a couple of years for us to cope with.
Thank you very much, Jörg and Michelle, for providing those insights on the difficulties you're facing with this. Now I would like to turn to our audience with a poll. You see the question on the screen now, and the question is, do you think airline planning has to become more dynamic, agile, and responsive during the restart? You can select your answer and click submit. The results will be displayed in about 60 seconds, so I encourage you to start voting now. You see the answers on the screen. While you are all voting, I would just like to say that today on the webinar we have over 700 participants from 107 countries. We have civil aviation authorities and regulators, airport authorities, ground handlers, airline and airport planners, coordinators and facilitators, as well as we have travel management companies and travel agents, and global distribution system providers. The results of the poll are actually quite clear. A lot of people, the majority of the people, think that indeed the airline planning has to become more dynamic and agile, as the crisis requires all those changes to happen very quickly. I would like now to hand over back to Laura for a part of this webinar.
Thanks, Dimitar, and thanks everyone for all the comments so far. Paul, just wanted to pick up on something you were saying about the planning now moving forward, because usually the airlines would be well into their winter season planning now for the Northern Hemisphere winter, which is obviously your summer season down in the Southern Hemisphere and one of your peak seasons, peak periods. What are you having to do to get ready to plan for this season, and what's different to how you would usually be planning there?
Thanks, Lara. Yes, you're right. Planning for northern winter has to continue. I mean, I said before that we're sort of putting out bushfires, pardon the pun, for down here, trying to battle through northern summer and figuring out what we're going to do there. But we still need to look at what we're doing in northern winter. The team currently is testing different scenarios for all our networks. I mean, we have an international network, a domestic network, and a regional network. The regional networks generally operate intrastate, obviously domestic between the two states, between two states or multiple states, and then international self-explanatory. We have border restrictions across the whole lot. There's only 2 states are currently within Australia that are allowing travel between each other, being New South Wales and Victoria. There is hope that they will lift those restrictions, and therefore we will be able to see what sort of demand there is for air travel. I mean, for us, probably, as is the case for most airlines, we're looking to design our network and ensure that we fly the right aircraft on the right route. Pre the pandemic or COVID-19, whatever you want to call it, we had all these plans in place. We were expecting some aircraft deliveries prior to the start of northern winter and also through northern winter. We were also planning to retire some aircraft over the same period of time, more or less a one-for-one swap. Unfortunately, what the pandemic did was throw all those plans in the bin. So what we've now had to do is work with limited aircraft resources to come up with a schedule that still reflects the demand across all the markets. We're faced with uncertain demand across these markets, primarily driven because of border closures. Now, we don't know, domestically we can probably predict when things are going to open. Internationally, we're unsure. Our own leaders are talking about perhaps Australia's borders being closed by some form of quarantine for the next 12 months. So that does make it difficult when you're trying to plan an international schedule. Once these conditions are relaxed, we have to make some assumptions on how our customers will return back to travelling. You know, what travel segments return at what rate? Will they return at the same rate? You know, will business return quicker than VFR? Will business return at all? These and there are many more questions that we look at when we look through each scenario. To manage all these challenges, we've brought several teams external to our department, which provide valuable input into the process. I'm not going to bore you with the long list of things that we're looking at, but some of the things is how long will it take to bring the entire fleet back into the air. I mean, we like most airlines around the world, have aircraft parked, sleeping, some are in a coma for an extended period of time. How long will it take us to bring all those fleets back to the air? What training, what retraining requirements do we have? How do we cater for those? With a limited fleet flying, it's very hard to keep pilots recent unless we use a lot of simulator time. With limited access to simulators, how do we still maintain all those sort of activities? The big question on everyone's lips, social distancing at airports. How will that affect our schedule? What will it do? Will it extend? Will there be a need to extend our turnaround times? How valid are our slots at these airports that now have these restrictions? Look, they're only a sample of some of the things that we consider when we're building all the various scenarios. And as you can imagine, there's multiple scenarios for each of these. I trust that everyone can appreciate what complexity the pandemic has actually added to our process. It's not easy. Hopefully it will get a little easier, but it will take time to get there.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think that's as well said. The complexity is definitely the main feature at the moment, I know, for every planning team and every airline globally. Moving on to maybe Santiago and the challenges you face in your market. I think you hinted at some of these earlier because of the way the LATAM group is set up, operating in multiple countries. With your network obviously operating at a number of non-congested airports and slot coordinated airports, so the more congested airports, is there a difference in how you may approach those in terms of the recovery planning, the schedule planning, and building that schedule back up from what you've got operating today?
Hi, Lara. Yeah, I could maybe put first in context about the LATAM network here in Latin America. We have operations in very important operations in several congested airports here in Latin America, mainly in Brazil, Peru, and Colombia. But also, as you mentioned, we have operation also in very important operation in some non-congested airports in Latin America, mainly in Chile, okay, but also in Argentina and Ecuador. And to try to explain or to answer the question that you put here, I would like to split the answer between the period that we are facing right now, that is the contingency moment, and the recovery and the restart phase. When we think about this moment, the contingency plan, the last 2 months, what really drives the difference between our scheduling process or dynamic is not if it is coordinated or not coordinated, because in each of the airports that we operate, mainly at different countries and different government decision about easing travel or travel bans or travel restrictions or lockdowns, what really makes the difference for our job in the day-to-day basis is how long each government decided to impose these restrictions and at what anticipation they decided to review. Okay. And it's different for Colombia, different for Peru, different for Argentina, very difficult, different for Brazil, for Chile, and also our operation will affect it for the long haul operations and the quarantines and restrictions on our routes. Then, as I mentioned, with the more short notice that the airport decided or the government decided to review the restrictions, the more work we need to do. And when the government decided to put a more longer-term restriction, like in Argentina, that we couldn't fly any flights in Argentina, touches Argentina, until the 1st of September, we could implement our schedule with a more long-term view, but it's very harmful for the industry with such a long restriction. And after talking about that, when we decided, we have the information, we decide the schedule, we try in the case of the coordinated airports to release the slots as soon as possible to the coordinator to have the full picture of our operation, also to the airports and the whole community. Nevertheless, in the case of the non-coordinated airports, in these cases, when we don't have the tool of communicating originally by the slot tool, still we have a continuous communication in each of the airports that we operate, that LATAM has very big operations, to try to inform our plans to each of the airports, to know our plans and how the airports could adjust the staffing in each of the airports to the new reality. That's for me more the contingency side of the equation. When we look at the future, as Paul mentioned, we look at the rest of the summer season, and we look at the winter season in November. There's a different story there, because in our case we have built some scenarios for recovery, more aggressive, more conservative, and we have a phase of recovery for the future at a very lower level, and we're waiting when each of the countries will decide to ease the restrictions, to eliminate the travel bans, to stop the lockdowns, to begin publishing and begin flying that scenario. And all the audience will know that we really don't know about that demand. That's scenarios that we think that will develop in the future. We're using some China information, that is the lead indicators what we are seeing. And we think that could be good scenarios in the future, but we really don't know. And there's a more complexity maybe in Latin America because there are different countries and different behaviors and different situations to the countries. Then, when we think about that, and we think about that in the next 12 months, we are looking at the very restart phase at a very low level of recovery, the main thing that we need here is flexibility. We need flexibility to understand, okay, I have my plan, but it's really the demand doesn't appear here in this market, but appears the other one at a different rate of recovery. We need to keep the freedom to adjust our scheduling where demand will be. okay? And that's important, first of all, to serve that demand that will appear, but also to not waste resources in empty flights. Because I don't know if I think all the audience will agree with me, in the next 12 to 18 months, still the industry will be in a survival mode. And we need, and as LATAM, we are pretty committed to the region. We are going to be here in the future, and we will serve all the communities and connect the passengers for business, for visiting families, for developing new services. And for that, we need flexibility. And we think about coordinated and non-coordinated airports. Really, for non-coordinated airports, these recovery phase will be more easy to lead with, because you have like enough flexibility to adjust to the real demand that will appear. And then for me, the very important thing here is right now, as Paul mentioned, we need to assure flexibility for the next 12 months at least in the coordinated airports to the airline have the flexibility to survive in this process and to put the flights where the demand will appear. That's for me the main difference between our network in the coordinated and non-coordinated airports in Latin America. Thank you.
Thanks, Santiago. I think that's really clear, and obviously there's a massive complexity to scheduling and planning when you've got so many different countries you're operating in as your base as well, and those government restrictions. I wondered if next we could go back to the whole panel, so all four of you. We've obviously heard a huge amount of restrictions, external factors, border closures and reopenings are massive question marks for any network planning team, scheduling team, and recovering your crew back in terms of their recency and currency checks, and getting the fleet back and stood back up, ready to operate. Added to that, I think, is the question mark around what airport capacity will be available. So I think a couple of you mentioned that obviously we don't know exactly what measures are going to be required and whether they will be the same globally or whether there'll be different variations of those, which is probably more the case within the airports, and also on board with the airlines. And nonetheless, the turnaround time impacts of disinfection of aircraft, better cleaning on board to ensure that you comply with all the regulations. Will that require a longer turnaround? And how do you manage that into your schedule? And then, of course, this big question mark around consumer behaviour and demand recovery and how quick that comes. So given all of these huge uncertainties that the airlines have, in some cases, some ability to manage, and in other cases, no control over at all, what would best support you in terms of the planning that you're now undertaking for this northern summer season and also the upcoming northern winter season? We've heard flexibility a lot, and perhaps there's other areas that would support you. If I could ask you to come back and speak to us now on those, and I'll go to Michelle first, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you, Lara. I think the first thing that we really need is for everyone to understand that these are not normal times. We have been in a very reactive mode for the last 2 to 3 months at this point. We are starting to move into the recovery phase, as we've discussed here, looking at when travel restrictions will be lifted, who can travel, consumer demand. But these aren't normal times, and I don't think any of us want to accept these as the new normal. And so that's, I think, the very first thing, is that we have to recognize this is a very abnormal period. So we're going to need additional flexibility. We're going to need to have close-in deadlines, not hard imposed deadlines put upon us to make decisions by certain dates. Because the reality is we just may not have the information needed by those dates in order to make those decisions. As we've seen, consumer demand is shifting. It is changing. They, like us, don't understand the travel restrictions. Consumers very much want to go on holiday right now. Everyone has been cooped up at home under various stay-at-home orders, and they're looking to get out potentially. But if they don't know if they can go to their desired destination until closer to that point, because the governments keep extending these travel restrictions. So I think flexibility is a key piece of this right now, and just general recognition of the uncertainty that's out there as the entire industry, airports, airlines, and consumers learn this new environment and work towards hopefully what is a new normal and getting back to our normal ways of operating, but that will take time. It's not going to happen in the next couple of months right away. It is going to be an extended recovery, as I think Jorg had pointed out earlier. I think that's the biggest thing right now. As I said earlier, and I do believe this, is that this is not an airport or an airline decision. Money of this is coming from government-imposed travel restrictions. We do not know when those are going to end. We are being advised of extensions to those on very short notice. And so we are still very much in a reactive mode. We do need to try to start looking ahead, though, and start thinking about this winter season and what is it going to be like. But without information from the governments as far as, you know, travel restrictions, health requirements, documentation that may be needed, it's hard to plan for that. And it's hard for consumers to try to book, not understanding those things either. And then there's always the airport environment as well. What kind of social distancing requirements will be required? Will you have additional screening that takes place? Will there have to be additional document checks, as you mentioned, getting into aircraft cleaning? So we really need flexibility against that capacity. We may not be able to turn our aircraft as quickly as we did previously. We may not have the same size aircraft flying. And of course, different aircraft fly at different speeds. So if we have less flights in the environment, but we're trying to upgauge them to add additional space on the flights for social distancing, they may fly at a different speed and our arrival time or departure times may need to change. But we still are working very much to understand what those requirements are going to be and work through those scenarios and rebuild those schedules. Right now, the biggest thing is just we need to have a global understanding of what's taking place. As I said, we have only had the summer 2020 slot use waiver for a little over 5 weeks for all the globe. We've done amazing work, I think, in those 5 weeks, rolling out schedules, understanding what would be feasible, which is only through October. But the sooner that we have that certainty of what the winter will be like, the sooner we can get started on that work in earnest and start rolling out those schedules. So to give the airports the information they need for planning, for their own personnel, for the gate usage, as well as then for the airlines, because we do have a lot of lead time that goes into what fleet will we be flying, the crews that'll be needed, as well as just our general employee staffing. So right now, I think the biggest thing is that we need to recognize these are unusual times. We need to work together to get through them. That's with the airports, the coordinators, and the governments, because a lot of this is government information that we need in order to make our plans. But we have to recognize that we won't have finite information by any set timeline. And we're going to have to remain a very nimble and agile industry and being very reactive to what comes our way, whether it be from the governments as far as health restrictions, or whether it comes from just consumer demand as consumers' confidence builds and they want to get out and want to start traveling again. Thank you, Lara.
Thanks, Michelle. No, it's really clear, and I'd like Jorg, if you could to tell us if you've got the same views or any different views on what would support you as you move forward.
Yeah, I think the basic question is actually, do we need planning at all in this uncertain times? I mean, there's a German saying that planning is replacing surprise by error, actually. So what is better? So as we see it, grounding an airline is much easier than restarting one, especially in a commercially rational way. I mean, we don't fly for fun, especially with the environmental conditions. We fly to make money, and right now we are flying actually to add cash to our cash reserves that are running thinly every minute and every hour. So restart, and we have heard this before, will be uncertain and already difficult all by itself because of probably the uncoordinated lifting of all the restrictions globally. So what would we need for support? First, we would need a coordinated approach by all countries, but that's probably even impossible because the coronavirus is hitting each country in a different time frame, and the flattening the curve is working differently in different countries. So will there be a coordinated approach? We can wish for it, but I guess it will not happen. But we might also find us in a situation where passengers and airlines actually want to fly again, but airport terminals become a new temporary bottleneck. This would clearly need congestion management by independent slot coordinators. That's what they are doing and what they are proficient with. But it would also mean that we need the extension of the global slot wave in a situation where we want to use our slots but cannot do so. And I hope it will not come, but the discussions everywhere are starting about the airport capacity. One example is security checks, where normally 100 people can be processed per hour. Now I hear stories about only 20 or 30 people can be processed with social distancing. So that's a reduction by 70, 80%. How do you cope with this if you want to fly again? So it will be a careful step-by-step approach that we will need to take. We would not be able to plan for a full season as usual, but we will have to schedule opportunistically depending on passenger demand and the absence of restrictions. And actually, we also have to change our structures, how we work. At Lufthansa, for example, in Frankfurt, we have a 6-bank operation with connectivity. Right now, with our only 5% of operations, we operate as 3 mini banks over the day, morning, midday, and evening. So that's totally different from our normal schedule structure, not only by the size, but also by the structure. So this all will change in short notice. So, and the biggest question of all for me is, will there be a second wave in some countries in winter? Who knows? So the second thing we need as a support, we need extra flexibility wherever that is possible in the whole value chain of air transport. And we as airlines don't have a crystal ball, but don't tell anyone else what's happening. We are sitting in the dark, and unfortunately, all our system partners in the value chain, they are sitting in the dark as well as we do. So yeah, maybe someone can put the light on. Thanks.
Thanks, Jörg. And Paul, and then Santiago. Good to hear your thoughts on this as well.
I'm not going to repeat what my colleagues have said. I mean, I totally agree with what both have said. For us, it's all about trigger points. What's a trigger point? Trigger point is border restrictions being lifted or something along those lines. What does that trigger point do for our business, and what do we need to do at each of these trigger points? From an industry point of view, everyone likes certainty, without a doubt. It helps stabilise what we do. It reduces the complexity of what we do. As airlines plan their northern winter schedule at the moment, certainly through a slot wave would greatly reduce the number of slot scenarios each airline is running. I would suspect that most of us have at least 2 schedules that we're planning towards. One inspired by a waiver or preferred, what we would call a preferred waiver schedule, which is demand driven, and a contingency schedule, which is a non-waiver schedule, which is basically designed to protect slots. My assumption is that these two are quite different. Our industry as a whole is in survival mode, and we need to really find ways of helping each other. That's all from me. Thank you.
And Santiago, if I could ask you finally to give us your views as well, which I'm sure echo those of your colleagues, but anything different to this?
Very difficult to be at the end with these great colleagues that talk very clearly about the support we need for the industry. But maybe some point to raise here is, in this moment of social distancing, we need to work together like we never did in the past. Because for me, the first point here is we not all the industry, all the stakeholders here in the aviation industry need to understand where we are and where we are going to be the next 12 months. And that will be a very difficult moment still. Just you said, okay, in the last 2 months, it's very difficult. But still will be very tough in the next 12 months. Because we all will have stress on the cash flow, stress to put the flights, stress to recover the airline. And if we all understand the industry, the real situation of the industry and the real situation for the next 12 months, all the things for supporting the industry will be very, very easy to get. And considering the waiver for winter 20 and all the stuff we need to live with this high uncertainty and the need for flexibility to put the flights when the will appear. And for me, the main point here is try to work as a team in the industry as maybe we never worked in the past. and try to understand where we are and where we are going to be in the next 12 months. That's the main point here. And with that, we are going to get the full support we need to run this business. Thank you.
Thanks, Santiago. I think everybody's made some really valid points there, and it's good to hear from all of you what the critical issues are for you and what you see coming up in the next couple of months, and as you say, the next 12 months actually, because 2 months at the moment feels like a very long time. I know for everybody working from home, managing these issues and the scale of the cancellations being made, but I think it's all becoming very clear now that this is something that's going to continue in terms of the rapid change, the need for you to adapt and the flexibility needed within the airline to react to the demand and the border reopening. So it feels like the new normal is somewhat chaotic and very much, as Michelle said, I think a nimble process needed to react to this demand. We wanted now to go over to the audience again and ask you a question. So the poll's now open. Please vote as you did before. We heard about the industry managing congestion, and under normal circumstances, we have the Worldwide Airport Slot Guidelines that help with this process. What does the audience think about managing the recovery? Will we see the need for congestion management? Or do you think that this is not a feature of the recovery period? So please vote now, and we'll then be able to see those votes come in. And while we're waiting for that, if you've got any last questions that you want to submit to us, please do that now, because we are going to very quickly go into the question and answer session in the next couple of minutes. We have received, I think, over 40 questions. So I can see we're going to need to get back to the pen and paper and answer these after the session, because we're not going to get through 40 of these in the next couple of minutes. But we will endeavour to answer all of them, and we will publish the questions and the answers as best we can online, which in some cases, I think, seeing some of the questions may require some of my colleagues in IATA in other areas to come forward, but that's no problem. We'll make sure all of those are answered in due course. I think the results will probably be coming up very soon. Here we are. I guess unsurprisingly, very small number of people have said they don't think there will be any need for congestion management. And most say it will be an absolute necessity, almost just 10% more. But some people think that this isn't perhaps as big an issue until the full recovery and there's a capacity crunch again. So it's interesting to see that. But certainly, I think everybody's aware, due to some of the airport restrictions that will be in place, social distancing and other issues, there may be some need for congestion management even in this recovery phase, which is perhaps something that a few people have not considered. So moving on to the next stage now, we've had a lot of questions come in. They've covered an awful lot of different topics, and as I said, we won't be able to cover all of them. But one that had come in, and I'm just trying to pick it up here, that would be quite interesting, I think, related to the discussions we've just been having. Somebody's asked, with Winter 20 looming, initial submission is now past us. For those on the call that are not that familiar with the slot coordination process, the airlines for slot coordinated airports, of which there's about 200 worldwide, have to submit their slot requests to a timetable, and the coordinators then look at those requests and allocate slots. The next feature of the calendar is the 4th of June, which is when the coordinators will have to allocate the slots to the available capacity. Obviously, the airlines and the coordinators, and indeed the airports who are providing this capacity, are working in somewhat of an unknown at the moment in terms of the quantity of capacity that will be made available, and indeed the demand that the airlines are placing on that. But the question is, with all of these different measures in place, social distancing requirements and other issues, how do you think the baseline for calculating any schedule reductions for looking at Winter 20 and then onwards as the historics that are gained from Winter 20 for Winter 21, how do you think that baseline should be set? I think we've had a number of discussions on this already as part of our slot policy working group, which includes some 20 airlines, both IATA members and non-members, around what we think is the fairest approach. Is we're already well into that process now, We have moved the slot return deadlines, so that's now 1 month later than it would have been, which is August, to hopefully give the airlines a little bit more time to get their plans together. However, August already feels very early when you're planning this winter season that's coming up. So I think what will happen if as usual, the handback deadline, which is the last day of August, will be the baseline date. So that's the slot historic baseline date. And that will be the focus of what you're measured on for winter. And indeed, as many have said, they hope that there will be a waiver for that winter period, so that in theory the schedule that you want to fly and the historics that you have put effort into for decades, and the schedules that consumers rely on, are not pulled apart through one season. And indeed, that's the situation we're in now for summer. I'd just like to ask if any of the panel would like to provide any comments around that question. So it's how would you make schedule reductions moving forward for winter, given that there has to be a baseline put forward? I'll just give it a couple of seconds to see if anybody wants to answer. Unmute your mic and volunteer if you would. Otherwise, I'll assume that they're happy with my response there.
Hey, Laura.
Okay.
I'll chime in for a moment. I am very happy with your response as well. But I just want to say that, even with the August deadline, I do think there is a concern as to what we will understand about the winter at that time. And I just need to emphasize that I think everyone needs to recognize these are not normal times, because while that is a wonderful deadline and a place right now in the process, and I do think we need to kind of be following process, again, the entire industry needs to be flexible to understand that if there is a recurrence, if there are new protocols that are required for social distancing within the airports or any of the alike, we may not be able to meet that deadline. And we're going to have to be understanding that we may not be able to meet that deadline, and that there will be changes that take place after that, just as response to the environment as well. So while we can say that there's a deadline set out there in August, and we are grateful that it's 4 weeks later than it has been in previous seasons, and that's a good move right now, that is a date on a calendar right now. And without certainty about a winter waiver, without certainty about understanding what will be capacity available at the airports, or what are going to be any sort of restrictions, we're going to do all we can as an industry to meet that deadline, but it is likely that there will also be reaction after it as well.
Perfect. Thanks, Michelle, and agree completely. And I'm sure any airlines on this webinar are nodding their heads as well to that. Given the time, I think we've probably got perhaps just one more question that we could quickly go through. And I'm so sorry to everybody that has asked questions, because you never know how many you're going to get on these, and we have got a lot coming in. So as I said, we will come back to those. But one question that I think probably covers a lot of people's sentiments, both as passengers and consumers, as well as industry at the moment in this regard. So in booking systems, we see flights shown as still operating for the months of July, August and September, but airlines are saying that they probably will not be operating all of these. Why does it take so long to cancel them? What's the problem? And I think I'll just volunteer a quick response and allow the airlines to come in here as well. But one of the issues I know that's been mentioned is the GDSs have had a backlog, as have the airlines, in actually moving their schedules from live active schedules into the cancellation program or what they are going to fly in those coming months. I think there's also a lot of uncertainty. We're seeing possibly light at the end of the tunnel somewhat, with borders starting very slowly to open through the months of June and July. And I think particularly for the Northern Hemisphere, being the peak period, airlines are desperately trying to see if they will be able to operate any of those peak summer season flights if the restrictions are open enough and the borders are open and there's not quarantine measures put in place that would reduce travel. So with all of that to say, I think the airlines are probably in some cases getting to those cancellations as they've explained, but also some of those flights that are still existing in the schedules are truly hoping to be serviced. So they don't want to cancel them now only to lose all those passengers and then see that the borders reopen and they could have been operating them. So does anybody have anything they'd like to add to that comment? It's around the booking systems for July, August and September, and will they be cancelled out? Why are they not cancelled out now? No, okay. Well, I know we're getting very close to the end of the webinar, and it's a shame we haven't got more time for questions, but I know everybody's had a lot of information from all of the 4 carriers here. Thank you ever so much to the 4 panelists, because this would have, the webinar would not have been anything if it wasn't for your insights and the realities that you've all experienced in the last couple of months, and indeed what you see as those issues coming forward. We were really pleased to be able to get a kind of full global coverage from the airlines on these issues, and hopefully anybody on the call, your region's been involved in this discussion. Just one last poll to ask all of you as you leave. We won't come back to the poll question, but if you found this subject matter interesting, or you'd like anything further to do with this subject matter area, by all means, please vote in this poll which other topics you'd like, or submit a Q&A on other topics that you'd like IATA to cover in the future. And then we will close off this webinar. Thanks to everybody, as I said, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. And I really hope it's been informative. It certainly has for us, and you've got something out of this webinar. We'll just wait for this poll to close. And while it's open, by all means, put any additional questions you have into the Q&A, and we will try our best to answer them afterwards for you. There's just 10 seconds now left with this poll, so please vote if you would like any further information on any of these topics. I think that poll question, the results are coming through, so we'll take that away and see. Of course, you didn't have to answer if you didn't want any other areas to be explained further in webinars with you.
I would like to conclude with some highlights and takeaways from the webinar. We heard about the overwhelming pace and volume of changes that led to the cancellation of the majority of the airline's current network. Also, with the uncertainty around reopening borders, requirements on travelers and demand being unpredictable alongside deep global economic recession, we can be sure recovery will be slow, patchy and challenging. Clearly, there is need for a continuity and certainty in the aspects airlines have control over to ensure the integrity of the schedule and the connectivity it provides globally to consumers, businesses and supply chains. Given how global and unrelenting the issue is, there needs to be temporary flexibility, but also consistency in the planning processes the global airlines rely on to build their schedule.
And lastly, just to let you know, we will be running a short survey at the end of this webinar, just to ask for your feedback, but also suggestions for any of those other topics that you would like. So it may be something totally related to scheduling that you may want to come back to us on and ask for another webinar session. And if you would like some more information or materials on airport slots, scheduling and planning, please scan this QR code, which will take you to the IATA website, where there's a lot more information for you. Thanks ever so much for everybody for joining us, and we hope to see you again shortly, perhaps on another webinar of a similar nature. Thanks to the panel. Bye-bye.